What is happening, everybody? UFC 297 is here, and we've got some cool new tools here at Stokastic.com. So I'm bringing back my MMA content, which I was always planning to do once the NFL season started to wind down, just happened to coincide with our new Sims product coming out. So it gives me some new talking points for doing my MMA content. If you guys were watching it last year, it's going to be more or less the same idea of the show, with me going through each fight and who I'm targeting for DFS purposes, as well as some bets that I like. But now also I'm going to be able to show some extra data on the screen using the Sims tool that we have at Stokastic.com, which also, if you guys want to sign up with it being a new product, if you use the promo code in the link that we have below, so promo code 297, and use the link that we have below, you get 30% off when you sign up for the first time. And I used this for the very first time testing it last week. And we had been testing it leading up to last week. However, there weren't any MMA events for about a month. So last week was the first time I actually got to use it for a real event. And I came in first place in the $3 on DraftKings. So I'm really excited to use this tool and play MMA DFS with it all year. The thing that's going to be most impactful to my process is now I could build lineups with the fighters that I like, but also it's going to weed out some of the lineups for me that are projected to be duped really heavily. So right here on screen, I have my fighter exposures as well as projected ownership. So we're going to be walking through each fight by fight right here. And then we'll also reference some of the data here in terms of ownership projections and then my personal exposure in my first round. This isn't necessarily the final lineups that I'm submitting, but it's kind of a rough outline of where I expect to be on Saturday by the time the fight card kicks off. But let's get into it. Starting with the main event, Sean Strickland against Dricus du Plessis. And for the first fight that I'm breaking down in 2024 in my video, I have no real clear read on this fight, other than the fact that I think the winner is going to score extremely well for DFS purposes. And that kind of plays out too in the exposures I got to in the lineups I built. So out of the 150 lineups I built, I have 75 Sean Strickland lineups, 75 Dricus du Plessis lineups. So 50-50 on the fight, with it being all in my lineup. So I'm getting one side of this in all of my lineups, but I just don't have a real clean read on it. If you look at some of the metrics, you see that both these guys have been striking at a really high pace during the run in the UFC. Sean Strickland lands 5.82 significant strikes per minute. Dricus lands 6.95. And these are two guys also who have made pretty big improvements to their games in recent fights. Their biggest wins coming their last times out. We saw Sean Strickland pull off a massive upset against Israel Adesanya in his last outing. And then Dricus du Plessis similarly pulled off a really big upset over Robert Whittaker in his last fight. So these are two fighters who just dispatched the guys who had been at the top of the division for forever. I mean, how long has it been since we've seen a title fight in this division in the UFC at 180 pounds that did not feature either Robert Whittaker or Israel Adesanya? I mean, if we go ahead and look here at the history of the 185-pound division, Izzy has been the champ since, well, let's see. So he beat Robert Whittaker in October 5th of 2019. And before that, Whittaker had been the champ since, let's see, so yeah, since July 8th of 2017. So we're looking at 7 years since neither Izzy nor Whittaker was in a title fight. And now we're getting to a spot here where I am having a really difficult time trying to figure out who to pick to win the fight, other than the fact that I think it's going to be kept at a really high pace. We saw Strickland open up as a small favorite, and a lot of money is coming on Dricus. So at the time of recording this, it's a pick 'em. It could go off with du Plessis as a slight favorite by the time we get to tomorrow. So I don't have a real good lean for you guys, other than the fact that I'm not betting on the fight. I'm playing in all of my DFS lineups, but don't worry, I have other takes for you as we go here. And one coming up here in a title fight that I'm not at all looking forward to. Mayra Bueno Silva taking on Raquel Pennington. Bueno Silva is a fairly significant favorite in this fight, and I don't really agree with the betting odds. I think it should be much closer to a pick'em. The big problem that I have with Mayra Bueno Silva is that she's not a minute winner. What happens is she's typically getting outstruck in a lot of her fights, which you can see based on her metrics here. She lands 4.16 significant strikes per minute. She absorbs 4.71. So most of her fights, she's losing until she gets a finish. She is also a fighter who's typically reliant on her grappling to get finishes. And part of the issue with that as well is that she has a lot of wins by submission, a guillotine over Holly Holm, but didn't land a takedown in the fight. She did land 2 takedowns against Lena Landsberg and got a knee bar, but those are the only 2 takedowns she's landed in her entire UFC career. So she has other subs on her record, an anaconda choke against Kellum, an armbar against Jillian Robertson, who's also fighting on this card, an armbar win over Mara Romero Barella. And in none of those fights did she land a takedown. She was dependent on other fighters initiating clinch or landing the takedown for it to get to the mat for her to land takedowns. So I can't really project her to land takedowns against Raquel Pennington, and Pennington's really difficult to finish. So that's where I don't agree with Buena Silva being a fairly significant favorite in this fight. And also, I think there's a pretty clear path to victory for Pennington, and it's a really shitty, boring one where we saw Buena Silva get controlled up against the cage for long stretches of time against Holly Holm. If we look at the stats from that fight, the fight ended in the second round, just 38 seconds into the second round. Holly Holm had 3 minutes of control time in a fight that lasted about 5.5 minutes. So this is pretty concerning for, number one, an entertainment value of the fight, but also the scoring upside of Mario Buena Silva, who I do think is probably relying on a first or second round finish to score well. And Raquel Pennington is just somebody who's super tough that doesn't get finished. The only time we saw her get finished in the UFC was a fight against Amanda Nunes back in, let's see, what year was that? 2018, and she took a hellacious beating. She took a crazy amount of punishment before ultimately being finished. 124 significant strikes she absorbed from Nunes in that fight. So I think this one's going to be really close. And as far as my exposure, I'm leaning more towards Raquel Pennington. If you guys see the lineups that I've built here, I have Pennington in 21% of my lineups and Buena Silva only in 13%. So it's a fight that I'm going to be underweight to. We've got Buena Silva here projected for 32.5% ownership, and I'm planning on being underweight to that mark. Next fight that we have here is Neil Magny against Mike Malott, and Magny looks fairly washed to me. He looked terrible in his last fight against Ian Gary. Didn't really do anything other than survive. I think it was like the first or second leg kick of the entire fight swept Magny off his feet, and he was off balance for the rest of the fight and was just doing everything he could to grab a hold of Gary and just extend the fight. He wasn't really putting any sort of offense out. In the end of the fight, 27 significant strikes landed in total for Neil Magny. So it was a very lopsided fight for him against Ian Gary. And I just don't think there's a whole lot left that Neil Magny has to bring to the table. Whereas Mike Malott, young fighter, 32, not super young at 32 years old, but a very talented fighter, well-rounded, power on the feet. He could wrestle, he could grapple. So I think this is Mike Malott's fight to win. I'm picking him to win by finish, probably in the first or second round. So Mike Malott, very serviceable pay-up option for this slate, and I don't really have any interest in Neil Magny as a pay-down option. Next fight here between Chris Curtis and Marc-Andre Barrio. The problem I have with this fight is it's a 3-round fight. Both of them keep a fairly decently high output on the feet. 5.36 significant strikes landed for Chris Curtis, 5.95 for Marc-Andre Barrio. But most of Chris Curtis fights end up being not all that great for DFS purposes. Typically, Chris Curtis is losing in the early going, comes back, wins the second and third round. Not always, but that's generally how we've seen his fights go. And we've seen him land some late knockouts as well after getting behind early in fights. But there's no real wrestling upside in this fight. Chris Curtis has never landed or attempted a takedown in the UFC. Marc-Andre Barrio only lands 0.24 takedowns per 15 minutes. And with Chris Curtis having a 92% takedown defense, we have a fight that's primarily going to be taking place on the feet without a lot of finishing equity. So it's one I don't have all that much interest in. As far as my exposure goes here, I got to 10% of Chris Curtis in the lineups that I had built. Marc-Andre Barrio showed up in 1% of these lineups. If I did have to pick one side of the fight to play, I would lean more towards the Marc-Andre Barrio side just because he's cheaper and it is a fairly competitive fight. If he wins and there's not that many underdogs that win on the card, there is a scenario where Marc-Andre Barrio could end up being in an optimal lineup from that standpoint. But one of my least favorite fights to target on the card. Should be a good one to watch. I just don't think it has that much scoring potential for DFS. Arnold Allen against Movsar Evloev. And Evloev is a prospect I really like. I think he is championship upside, but he's unproven. And there are some things I'm pretty concerned about. Most notably, he gets in trouble in almost all of his fights at some point. Either he gets clipped on the feet and wobbled, or he gets into a precarious grappling situation where he gets himself deep into a submission, which we saw against Mike Grundy. There's a couple of very, very close chokes that Grundy nearly finished. Evloev was able to survive and ultimately win the fight, but didn't really put a lot of output in that. Didn't land any takedowns, 79 significant strikes, and we have never seen Evloev land more than 88 significant strikes in a fight. Now he's taking on Arnold Allen, which is a massive step up in competition for Evloev. His last fight came against Diego Lopez. Lopez took the fight on just a few days' notice. Now, since then, I think we have noticed that Diego Lopez probably a lot better than we thought he was going into the fight. So it's a better win in hindsight than at the time it looked like for Evloev, but there was still a lot of precarious moments. Evloev was caught deep in some submissions. He got hurt a couple times on the feet by Diego Lopez. So I'm concerned about Evloev stepping up to face Arnold Allen in this fight. It's a fight where I do have a little bit of interest in both sides because if Evloev wins, it's going to have to be from wrestling grappling. If he wins, I think he probably lands 3+ takedowns, holds a lot of top control time. Whereas if Arnold Allen wins, I think it probably means he was able to stuff the takedowns and maybe even hurt Evloev on the feet. So interesting one to target. My preferred DFS play here is Arnold Allen because there aren't that many underdogs that I really like for the slate. And because Evloev's striking is so untested and we've seen him hurt so many times, I think Arnold Allen is live to hurt and finish Evloev. And let's see, what is the projected ownership we have in here for Arnold Allen? Yeah, only 14% projected ownership for Arnold Allen. So interesting contrarian play to save some salary with if we're looking for a couple of punt options to get to. Next fight here is Brad Katona against Garrett Armfield. And as for Katona, we've seen him in the UFC in the past and wasn't a very exciting fighter. Fairly boring fight style. That was not the case in his last fight against Cody Gibson. It was the tough finale. It was a crazy back and forth fight. 164 significant strikes landed by Gibson, 160 by Brad Katona. Katona, who typically, when he's won fights in the past, it's been with his wrestling and being able to control guys, sometimes clinching up against the octagon. Didn't even do that against Cody Gibson. These guys just went to war on the feet. And it does make me think, are we going to see a different version of Brad Katona going forward where maybe there's a little bit more scoring upside from him in a matchup against Garrett Armfield? And then something else to consider as well is that maybe we do see Brad Katona get back to the takedown game, which if he does, that's another path to upside for him. So sneaky upside play here in Brad Katona. We can't say for sure that he's changed his fight style based on the last fight, but I think it's a possibility because the reason his first run in the UFC ended, it's not like he was non-competitive. They put him in really difficult matchups. So we saw him win his UFC debut against Matthew Lopez. Then his next fight in the UFC, they give him Merab. All right, he lost to Merab, but it wasn't like we saw him totally get crushed by Merab like other people did. Merab only landed 5 takedowns. The striking differential was 55-32. So how can you expect him to reasonably compete with Merab Dvalishvili, who may be the best fighter in the division? And then we saw him fight against Hunter Azure, and total robbery. I thought Katona won that fight cleanly. The judges end up giving the fight to Hunter Azure, and then Brad Katona ends up getting cut from the UFC. So I think from there, he kind of evaluated his performances in the UFC and said, hey, if I want to keep a job here in this organization, I need to be in more exciting fights, which we certainly saw against Cody Gibson. Crazy output. Actually, the 160 significant strikes, that is more than he had in his 3 UFC fights prior to that combined. So Brad Katona, sneaky upside for him, in my opinion, this matchup against Garrett Armfield. Charles Jourdain against Sean Woodson. I'm interested to see if Jourdain attempts takedowns in this fight because he has a massive advantage on the ground against Sean Woodson. And Woodson's also very long. So I don't know that Jourdain is going to want to fight at distance with Woodson. Woodson has a 5-inch reach advantage. He has a 9-inch reach advantage in this spot. So I do think it makes sense for Jourdain to try to close the distance, land takedowns. On paper, Woodson does have an 83% takedown defense, but he's never really fought anybody who's a real takedown threat. And to be clear, it's not like we've seen Charles Jourdain as much of a takedown threat in his career either. However, the last time we saw him in a fight where it actually made sense for him to shoot takedowns came in a fight against Shane Burgos, and there was some wrestling and grappling exchanges in that fight where Jourdain didn't look particularly great on the mat, but I do think this is a fight where maybe there is some wrestling grappling that we could see from Charles Jourdain, who in some ground situations with Kron Gracie, Jourdain was able to hold his own on the feet, on the ground. We saw Kron Gracie pull guard a couple of times in that fight. And I do think that if this fight is to hit the mat, Jourdain would have an advantage. So sneaky path to victory for Charles Jourdain if he wrestles. And if it takes place on the feet as well, I think it's a fairly high striking output sort of fight. Not a whole lot of finishing equity. I don't want to prioritize this fight, but it's a little bit higher of a priority than, say, like Chris Curtis versus Marc-Andre Barrio for me. Next fight, Sidney against Ramon Taveras. We saw this fight take place on the Contender Series, and we didn't really get a whole lot of data from it. So Sidney ended up winning by KO, but it was a really terrible stoppage by Kevin McDonald, who's had a couple of really terrible stoppages. So McDonald stopped this fight totally ridiculously. There was a knockdown by Sidney. Taveras was trying to get back up. It was only a couple of minutes into the fight, and almost immediately, McDonald steps into the fight and stops it. The other stoppage he had that was egregiously terrible was even worse than this one. If you guys remember the Ion Cutelaba fight against Magomed Ankalaev, where Ankalaev landed a couple of head kicks and they were still fighting on the feet, and it kind of looked like Cutelaba was starting to get a little bit wobbly, and McDonald just stepped in and stopped the fight before we even saw a knockdown or anything like that. So this was probably the second worst stoppage of his career that I've seen, but it was a really bad one. And the takeaway being is that we didn't really get a whole lot of data on that fight. We saw Sidney and Taveras each land 11 significant strikes, a little bit more output on the Sidney side. But once again, the fight only lasted 2 minutes and 26 seconds. But this is a fight that I think makes a lot of sense from a DFS perspective because both these fighters have a lot of power. I do think the most likely scenario is that somebody's going to get KO'd. This is a fight that's expected to finish inside the distance. So if we look at all of the underdogs that we have on the card, like I mentioned, Arnold Allen is a potential play that I like for cheap. And I talked about liking Raquel Pennington for cheap. By the way, as something I forgot to mention, I did bet Raquel Pennington plus 142 is the best available line at FanDuel. I don't feel great about it or anything like that, but the line a little bit too wide, like I mentioned before. That aside, so Taveras against Sidney, I do think this fight finishes early. And of the underdogs that are live on this slate, I think Taveras is some of the most upside because if he wins, it probably is going to come by KO and it probably lands him in an optimal lineup. So good fight to target here on DraftKings. And let's see, what did I get to as far as exposure here on Taveras? Because I might want to do, 36% of them. I feel pretty good about that. And then Sidney, I had in 27% of lineups. So yeah, it's a fight that I have in north of half of my lineups, a lot of finishing potential. And it's one that I think we should be targeting. Ramon Taveras, 36% of my lineups in first run here. One of my favorite underdogs to target on the slate. Let's go ahead and look at the next fight here, which we have between Jillian Robertson and Polyana Viana. Jillian Robertson not projected for a ton of ownership and actually landed in a ton of my lineups. So I was running through everything. Only 24% projected ownership coming into Jillian Robertson. And if you can see here, she is currently the fighter I'm getting to the most in my lineup. So why is that the case? It's because of the matchup here and some of the data we have. So if we see a win from Jillian Robertson, it is always coming from wrestling and grappling. So with that in mind, her wins almost always score right around 100 fantasy points, if not higher. We've seen her score as much as around close to 120 fantasy points. Takedown defense for Polyana Viana sits at just 43%. Jillian Robertson I view as the much more potent offensive wrestler, the better grappler. And considering the poor takedown defense that Polyana Viana has and the physical advantage that Jillian Robertson has, she lands 2.46 takedowns per 15 minutes. I do think that all it will take is one takedown for Robertson to win in this fight. And she probably is able to dominate Viana on the ground, likely submit her. We saw Viana in her last fight against Jasmine Lucindo, and she got taken down and submitted in that fight. And Lucindo is not the same offensive wrestler or grappler that Robertson is. So I favor Robertson pretty heavily in this fight. Viana is live for a knockout on the feet. She's a very high variance fighter. We have seen her knock out opponents before. She knocked out Jin Yu Frey in a fight that was like minus 400 or something like that to go to the judges' scorecards. So I really do like Jillian Robertson as a pay-up option. I'm not going to totally fade Polyana Viana, but clearly my preferred option in the fight is Jillian Robertson, especially based on the ownerships that I was showing to you guys here. I mean, she's in 2/3 of my lineups. I like Jillian Robertson quite a bit as a pay-up option. So let's move on to a couple other fights left here to talk about. Next one, Johan Lainesse against Sam Patterson. This is probably my least favorite fight to break down on the entire card. Like, at least when I didn't have a real clean read on Du Plessis against Strickland, it's a fight that I know that I want to target. The problem with the Lainesse Patterson fight is that Patterson has terrible striking defense. He has a bad chin. He leaves it up to get hit as well, which is why we saw him get knocked out very quickly against Yanal Ashmouz. We've seen Patterson super tall for the 155-pound division, so he actually is changing weight classes, and he's fighting up at 170 pounds here against Lainesse. So this is going to be his first fight at 170 pounds, even though the UFC website here has him at 155 pounds. So Lainesse has massive power. If he lands on Patterson, I think he probably knocks him out. The problem with that is that Johan Lainesse does not do anything in his fights. He doesn't really throw strikes. His last fight was against Mike Malott, who's also on this card. He landed one significant strike, gets finished in the first round. Fights against Darian Weeks. Johan Lainesse wins a split decision by landing 23 significant strikes, which has to be close to the least amount of strikes I've ever seen somebody land in a victory. I think fairly close to what Derek Lewis landed in his win over Francis Ngannou. A loss against Gabe Green, where Lainesse got finished. Lainesse landed just 41 significant strikes, and then when we saw him fight on Contender Series, he landed a knockout, but it was only by landing a total of 5 significant strikes. So Lainesse is very live for a knockout in this fight, but if he doesn't land the knockout, he's going to lose because he doesn't do anything in his fights. So Sam Patterson is a live underdog, but I'm very concerned about his durability. So it's a fight that is worth some exposure to because it's priced in the mid-range, but it's hard for me to prioritize because if there is not an early knockout by Lainesse, and if Sam Patterson fights really conservatively because he's concerned about his chin, the winner of this fight is going to score like 60 fantasy points. So my current exposure to this right now, I have Lainesse in 28% of lineups, Patterson also in 28%. Patterson's only projected for 13% ownership, so he is somebody who is pretty easy to get overweight to the field to. But I'm probably going to lower my exposure a little bit to Lainesse here because I'm really concerned that if he doesn't get that first round finish, he's just totally dead for the card. I just can't see him scoring well outside of a first round knockout. Couple fights left here to target. And one other way for you guys to find value this weekend, BetMGM has an offer right now, and there's a link for it below. If you guys sign up at BetMGM using our link, you place a $5 bet at BetMGM, and they're going to give you $158 in bonus bets. That is for Super Bowl 58. So easy offer to take advantage of and put some extra money in your pocket. If you or anybody know has a gambling problem, call or text the number 1-800-GAMBLER. But another way to find some value on this slate is taking advantage of some of these free sportsbook sign-up offers. Jasudavicius against Priscilla Cachoeira. Cachoeira, no surprise, was not going to make weight for this fight, so they changed it to a 135-pound fight. Priscilla Cachoeira misses weight about as often as she makes weight, and then once she gets into the octagon, because cheating by missing weight is not enough for her, so she's also eye gouging, she's sticking her fingers in gloves. Any rules that you could break, Priscilla Cachoeira is doing it 2-3 times per round, and for this fight, it's a terrible matchup for her. She is 0 takedown defense or grappling. And even though the 65% mark is here, it is much lower than that. We've seen Priscilla Cachoeira just grounded over and over in a lot of her fights. And that is the path to victory for Jasudavicius in all her fights. So she lands over 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. I think she lands takedowns at will against Priscilla Cachoeira. The problem with Jasudavicius from a DraftKings purpose, she's so expensive. You have to pay up for her as being the most expensive fighter on the card. And once you get to some of those fighters who are like 9,500 plus in terms of pricing, it's really hard for them to land in an optimal lineup, especially on a card like this where there aren't a ton of value options to feel great about. So I'm underweight here to Jasudavicius, currently landing in 16% of my top lineups. Next fight, and the last one to get to, it's a really interesting one between Malcolm Brogdon and Jimmy Flick. So this fight is priced in the mid-range. It's got 2 fighters who are, 8,300 and 7,900 in this matchup. And Malcolm Gordon has seen an insane amount of line movement. This line has gone from being a pick'em to Malcolm Gordon now north of a -200 favorite, which means he is going to be massively chalky this week. Malcolm Gordon is projected for, filter by him here, Malcolm Gordon is projected for north of 40% ownership. With him being projected for north of 40% ownership, I get it. It's based on the line value and what the betting lines are. The problem I have with it is that I don't agree with the betting lines. I actually did bet Jimmy Flick this morning. So I like Jimmy Flick now that he's all the way up to like a plus 170. I think this line should be close to a pick'em. And the main reason for that is neither of these guys have any durability. Malcolm Gordon and Jimmy Flick have both been finished numerous times. And there's also 0 takedown defense in this fight. And by 0 takedown defense, I literally mean 0. Jimmy Flick has a 0% takedown defense. He has never successfully defended a takedown in the UFC. Malcolm Gordon has a 9% takedown defense. He hardly ever successfully defends takedowns. So the way I see this fight, it could be as easy as whoever the first fighter is to shoot a takedown, lands the takedown, and may ultimately win the fight. So between Jimmy Flick and Malcolm Gordon, I think Flick is the more physical of the two. I think he's stronger. I view that being his advantage. Whereas Malcolm Gordon, I think, is much faster. I think he's the better striker, and I think he's more athletic. So if this fight plays out on the feet, I would favor Malcolm Gordon. If this fight does get into wrestling scenarios and grappling scenarios, I think Jimmy Flick is the better wrestler grappler, and I think he's live for a submission. So since I think this fight is close to a 50-50, and also this fight is like minus 130 to finish inside 1.5 rounds. So Malcolm Gordon, still getting exposure to him, a little bit underweight to him though. 25% of my top 150 lineups have Gordon when he's projected for north of 40% ownership. And on Jimmy Flick, I've got him in more than half my lineups solely for leverage purposes. If Gordon is really going to have 2x the ownership of Jimmy Flick because of the betting line, and it's a betting line that I don't agree with, then I'm going to take my chances on a leverage play here in Jimmy Flick, because if he wins, I'm going to get myself a massive advantage over the field. It's super risky because if Gordon wins, a lot of my lineups are going to be dead. Not fading Gordon or anything, but I think that's the leverage play on the slate. If you guys agree with the betting line, you think that Gordon should be a 2-1 favorite, go ahead and load up on him in DFS. I don't have an issue with that standpoint. I just don't agree with the betting line. So I'm going to take a chance on Jimmy Flick as a big leverage play for this weekend slate. So that is going to do it for me. And if you guys want to check out our new Sims tool, which you could build your MMA lineups here in the contest generator, you could simulate them. So you could build up to 10,000 lineups. If you have the max package, the base package, you can build up to 500 lineups. It only takes like 30 seconds to build all those lineups, and it takes another minute or so to simulate them. And then you can change your lineups based on how you see the slate going. So like if there's a fighter that you really like, you could do them an ROI boost upgrade to them, and you could up the amount of exposure you're getting to fighters in your lineup. So lots of ways to customize this. I also have a video up on the site for how to best use the Sims tool. So I hope you guys take advantage of it. Help me win the $3 the first time I used it this year. And if you use that promo code 297, you get 30% off if you sign up for the first time. So good luck this weekend, guys. If you have any questions, leave them below in the comments section. We'll see you back here, not next week because there's no card, but 2 weeks. I'll be back. Regular MMA content for me weekly. Peace out.